Well, welcome. Good morning. We're so excited that you can join us today. This issues class is part of some of the education that we're doing as part of Dairy Church's 300th year anniversary. We're trying to help all of us to better understand our history, our church's history, and how it intersected with the broader context, particularly with Indigenous peoples who are already living here and caretaking this land. Today we have a very special guest with us, Adam Waterbear DePaul. He is a chief of the Lenape Nation of Pennsylvania, where he serves as tribal storykeeper and director of education. He collaborates with academic institutions on initiatives related to the Lenape people, including land acknowledgements, mascots, representation, programming, and curriculum development. He is a PhD candidate at Temple University and a scholar in residence at Arcadia University. He currently teaches college courses in Indigenous Studies, World Mythology, and Lenape Stories. He co-curates the Lenape Cultural Center in Easton, Pennsylvania, and the Lenape Enduring Presence exhibit, which is now traveling from Haverford College to Arcadia. So Adam, we are so excited for you to be joining us. Thank you so much.
It's so wonderful to be invited. Thank you for having me here. And I'm thrilled to hear the wonderful series of programming you have here. I just heard a little bit about the ongoing series, and it sounds like you really have a wonderful thing going on. Even though I'm going to get in as much information as I can in the short time we have together, obviously there's so little I can touch on in just an hour, and some of these other programs are really filling in some of those gaps. So I really applaud your initiative in being interested in really learning this Indigenous history. I do always like to begin by introducing myself in my own language, in Lenape. So, I'll speak Lenape now briefly. Delawanzi Sakima Adam Bimak, Lepoyinu ni Lenape Nation of Pennsylvania, Ok Nulhalauk Nek Achami Wakanek, Ok Windamachweoken. And that's nothing beyond that wonderful introduction that Miara gave me. But language is incredibly tied into culture and identity. And as I'll talk about a little bit later, our language is very, very endangered. So it's always good to bring it out when we can. But I'm going to jump right in. And in this short time, I'm sure you understand that I'm not going to be able to do any of our people or any of the history or our presence justice. What I hope to do is to give you enough of an orientation to understand who the Lenape people are, understand the kind of cliff notes to our history, let you know some of what we're doing today to revitalize our culture, and let you know who I am here today representing, the Lenape Nation of Pennsylvania, which is only one of the several Lenape nations on the continent today. So if I can do all that in this little time, I'll feel like a success. But again, this won't really do much justice to the true experience our people have had throughout the years. But to dive right in, I like to start with a little bit of information of our pre-colonial life. Oh, and I'm going to hide this in case you're getting those Zoom white dots at the top of your screen. I learned how to do this.
We're good. Yeah, you're good.
Oh, I'm good? Okay, wonderful. I won't bother that then. So the Lenape people are the indigenous people of northern Delaware, eastern Pennsylvania, southern New York, and all of New Jersey. This is often what is called the Lenape Hoking. And I like to stop there for just a minute for a very brief language lesson. So that word Lenape Hoking, that's just the word Lenape with a suffix on the end that means the land where this thing is, or the place where this thing happens. And I like to bring that up because even though you hear Lenape Hoking, the suffix is ink. We don't pronounce that hard K on the end. We don't say Lenape Hoking in our language. But that's good to know because one way that you'll still encounter our culture very often throughout our homelands is in our language and specifically in place names. Anytime you see that INK or HO KINK ending on a place name, that's a very good signifier that that probably comes from the Lenape language. I'm zooming in from my home today up in the Poconos, and I'm just about 20 minutes from Mauchunk, if you've heard of that. Other places like Minisink, Passayunk, Manayunk, all of these places come from the Lenape language. And of course, that INK is a good signifier, but it's not the only signifier that our language is used in place names. I think one of the most fun town names to say in the whole country, in my opinion, is right over the border in New Jersey in Hoboken. Right? And Hoboken comes right from our word for pipe, hupokon. So people in our homelands drive through and pass through and live in towns that are named in our language, sometimes for generations and generations, and often have no idea about where that word comes from or who our people are. It's a very unfortunate situation because our history and our presence here has been so erased. There's so much I can say. I could spend, all day just talking about our people prior to colonization. But with this short time, I'm going to zoom past, tens of thousands of years of history in order to start talking about colonial contact. Please feel free in question and answer to ask anything before this. But one reason I like to get here pretty quickly is because one problem, one challenge that all Native Americans face is being framed as a historical artifact, of people who once existed a long time ago, right? If you delve into archives and history books and missionary documents, you can find some information about our pre-colonial history. What is even more difficult to find is what happened to us after colonialism, after first contact. With many of the history books and courses and exhibits, you'd get the idea that we just kind of evaporated sometime maybe around the French and Indian Wars. So our presence here and our recent history is almost twice erased, which is why I really like to fill in those gaps. And I like to start with William Penn. A lot of my students ask about William Penn. They've heard kind of the legend that William Penn was this, legendary, almost mythic figure in his benevolence and work with our people. And they ask me about the accuracy of this, and it's good that they do, because I think we know more and more often now that when we hear these stories that sound larger than life, it's always good to stop and examine them to see where those stories came from. But Penn and the legend of Penn, this is one legend to which there actually is very much truth. William Penn was far above and beyond other colonial leaders of his time in trying to establish friendly and respectful relationships with us. Now, I always have to stop to say Penn was not perfect. None of us are. He was definitely a product of his time, and there are parts of his life that should be examined. There are, of course, things he could have done better in his relationships with us and other parts of his life, like his involvement in slavery. But without examining him through hundreds of years of hindsight, in his time and for his time, he really was, I don't think it's too strong to call him a radical in working towards having good, respectful, honest, friendly relationships with our people. Our ancestors treasured our relationship with William Penn, and we still honor our relationship with William Penn today in a treaty that we sign every 4 years, which I'll talk about in a minute when I get up to what we're doing today. One thing I like to bring up to emphasize this fact is that Penn took pains to learn our language. And that is not an easy thing for a European language speaker to do. Like most Native American languages, our language works on a very different grammatical system. But Penn still put the effort in and learned our language. Now, it turns out he didn't learn our entire language in its full complexity. That would have taken a lifetime. But he learned what linguists refer to as a trade jargon, a watered down version of the language that is enough to communicate clearly and do business and enough to be understood. Still not an easy feat. Penn did this for a number of reasons. I'm actually sitting right next to this book. I have it on my desk here because I use this book to teach in my classes. And if you read this book, it's a wonderful insight into Penn's mind because these are his letters that he wrote to our people and about our people. And he speaks in very high regard of many aspects of our culture, including our language. He loved the way it sounded and the directness of its communication. But the primary reason that Penn learned our language is because he realized that people were taking great advantage of us, particularly in written agreements, land agreements, treaty dealings. Some people who have done some research on these first early treaties, they look at these agreements and they say, why would your people ever have signed these documents where you're giving away so much of your possessions, so much land for next to nothing, or sometimes literally nothing other than that signature? And I could talk about, for 40 minutes just on all of those factors. But two important things to understand is that, first of all, our language was never a written language. Like many Native American side people and like many indigenous people all over the world, our language was strictly through the oral tradition. We were a people of the oral tradition and of conversations. We didn't write things down. It was colonial missionaries that came over and heard us speaking who devised a written system for what they heard. And that was primarily for the reason for missionary efforts, because then when they had a written system, they would start translating sermons and the Bible and other missionary documents to circulate among our people. The oldest written documents in the Lenape language are missionary documents. So that's important to understand because just the idea of I hand this piece of paper to you and you sign it, and this is a legally binding contract that holds all parties responsible heretofore. This was not how we did business. This was not how we traded with our relations, and we had no concept of the power of this legal document that came over the ocean. Now, of course, you add to that the language barrier. While missionaries had devised a system of language for the missionary efforts, these documents, these legal binding documents, were not being written in that language. They were being written in German or English or Swedish or whatever the dominant language of the colony was. So our people were very much in the situation where these new neighbors come across the ocean were just coming up to us and putting these papers in front of us and saying, hey, make these marks at the bottom. And they could really say anything they wanted to make that happen. And with no reason to suspect it could be trouble, many of our people just smiled and did. So people were, of course, taking great advantage of us in that way. Penn saw that happening, and he didn't want any part in it, and he didn't want his colonists to have any part in it, his society. So Penn learned a version of our language, and then he trained some of his people in our language. And then he insisted that anytime his people had dealings with ours, that there be a Lenape interpreter there who could clearly uh, explain to us what those documents meant, and not just the words on the document, but the actual what signing a legally binding document meant. So as you can imagine, after a little while of this understanding and learning about this practice, you see those signings drop off very sharply, of course. Um, so all this is wonderful. Where did everything go wrong, right? Where did things turn? And they actually turn very quickly. Um, because Penn, many people don't realize that Penn was here for a very short time. He's such a legendary figure and did so much. But he came here, he touched down, he established some relationships, he got some great frameworks going, but then he was back over the ocean, back home. Who remained here were his descendants. And it's with his descendants where things take a drastic turn. Um, Penn's sons had no interest in the spirit of their father, in being friends and relations and respectful people living, neighbors living together. Penn's sons wanted our land and they wanted us out of it. I always like to bring up the fact that Penn's sons had formerly renounced Quakerism. So they were following their father neither in spirit nor in faith. But partly because of the good deeds that Penn had done, it was getting harder to just shove a paper in front of our face and have us sign it. We were starting to catch on. So what you have in the period of Penn's sons is a time of more deceit, more subterfuge. Penn's sons and their era of colonists try to devise ways to manipulate us into signing away our lands and possessions. Probably, well, not even probably, the most well-known today of these manipulative agreements is the walking purchase. This is just one of many kind of underhanded treaty dealings, land dealings, but it remains the most popular by far. Um, so we had made an agreement with Penn's sons, largely out of respect for their father, that we would give them some land here so they could live here as our neighbors. And based on a long line of tradition, we decided that to uh, decide the area of the land, we'd go out to our sacred river, to the Delaware River, and we'd walk in a northwesterly direction. Can you see my mouse moving on the screen?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. Um, and we decided we would walk for a day and a half. And after that day and a half of walking and talking and getting to know each other and discussing how they use the land and how we could build our communities in a good way together, we would draw a line back to the Delaware River, and that triangle of land, with the river being the eastern border, would be how much land we'd give Penn's sons. So Penn's sons orchestrated a number of things after that agreement, but before the day came. The first thing they did is they came and they brought in contractors to clear a lot of this great thick northeast woodlands to make it easier travel, more straightforward travel. The second thing they did was they scouted their ranks and they brought in 3 of the best professional runners they could find. So when we went out and all gathered that day, as we got ready to go walk with our new friends and start discussing these matters, those 3 runners took off running down these partially or sometimes largely cleared straight tracts that had been mowed down here. Our people continued on for some time before realizing that nobody was coming back to walk with them, and then kind of went to figure it out, what was happening, what was going on. Now, those runners kept running. 2 of them had to stop out of exhaustion. They couldn't keep running the full day and a half, but one of them did. And he got up to here, up to the Jim Thorpe area. Then as a final bit of subterfuge, if you remember, the agreement was that wherever they stopped, we would draw a line back to the river. Well, you can see that this line is anything than a other than a horizontal line back to the river. When they were drawing this line, they literally tilted the map so that when they were drawing the line, it was a horizontal line, but because they tilted the map, it essentially doubled, actually a little more than doubled the area. And when the map was set straight again, it was a huge obtuse angle like this. So at the end of the day and a half, when we thought we were probably giving, a good couple acres to Penn's sons to raise a family here, we ended up signing away um, about 1,200 square miles of our land. That's about the area of Rhode Island State. It was absolutely devastating. And one of the clearest examples to our people that we could no longer trust, that our relationship with the colonists was no longer on that foundation of trust and respect that William Penn had designed. So, like I said, the walking purchase is the most well known today, but there were many. This was a period of these kind of underhanded, deceitful land grabs. And after enough of our land had been secured on these pieces of paper, it finally came time to get us out. And this would happen most directly in the next generation with William Penn's grandsons. This is an artifact we have at our cultural center. Our cultural center is in Easton, Pennsylvania. We have this actually blown up wall size. And this is a 1764 Pennsylvania Gazette, the main newspaper of the time. And in the first column, front page, the prime real estate of the paper here, John Penn, this is John Penn, William Penn's grandson, not John Penn, William Penn's son, um, publishes prices that he will pay colonists who bring in Lenape scalps as proof that they had killed a Lenape person, or who bring in live Lenape people to be brought into captivity. And those of us brought into captivity would often then be sold into forced labor, either here in our homelands, or we'd be packed into boats and shipped over the ocean to where colonialism was spreading in other directions. The prices that John Penn offered are very succinctly broken down here between different prices for Lenape men, Lenape women, and Lenape boys under 10 years old, and Lenape girls under 10 years old. So none of our people were safe. None of our people were excused from these bounties. Now, it's at this point in time that our people, as a geographic entity, as a people who live all together in one area, become fractured. Many of our people at this time are forced to leave their homelands. Some of them pick up their family clans and flee, flee being hunted. Some people band together and try to put up fights and resistance and do put up fights. And there are some bloody battles here as our people dig in and try not to be chased out. But many of our people are, in the end, driven out by military forces. So our people, over the next few years, spread all over the country and continent. Our people get pushed or flee in any direction they can, any direction that they're pushed or that they flee. And those of us that, or those of our people that flee, they go as far as they can until they look around and feel like this might be a safe area. And this is something else I often find myself having, or I feel like I should explain to my students when they come in. They often have an idea that, sometime, a lot of Native American people were forced from their homelands. But I get the sense that they feel it was, well, one day the Lenape picked up from Pennsylvania and walked out to Wisconsin and settled down, and that was the day they were removed. what I have to emphasize to them is that these removals were the process of years and decades, and in sometimes literally centuries of continuous moving, looking around, thinking our people might be safe, starting to settle, reestablishing our communities, until the frontier catches up with us and uproots us, and then we had to move our communities further. So we might get out to Eastern Pennsylvania, spend some time there, and then get uprooted again to Ohio, and then Indiana, and then Kansas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this happened in all directions. We actually had one band of our people that got pushed out to Kansas, and then broke off from their main group and went all the way down to Texas. And for a while, there was a Lenape community in Texas before those people traveled back up north to join their relationships in Oklahoma. So today, there are representatives of that diaspora, of those people who were forced to leave all over the country and continent. Um, Here in the United States, we have 3 tribes that are recognized by the federal government. That is the Delaware Tribe of Indians in Oklahoma, the Delaware Nation in Oklahoma. Um, we also have a federally recognized tribe in Wisconsin, the Stockbridge-Munsee tribe. There are 2 more nations up in Canada that are recognized by the Canadian federal government. And those 5 nations are the only federally recognized nations that exist, the only Lenape nations recognized by their federal government. But we have many other communities of our diaspora that are not recognized by the federal government. Like we have a sizable community in Kansas and in Ohio and in other places. So meanwhile, I want to shift attention back to our homeland because not all Lenape people were forced to leave our homeland. Some of our people remained here, and there's a number of ways that could happen. Some of our people broke off into small groups and went into hiding. Some of our people, unfortunately, were brought in on John Penn's bounties or other bounties like it, and we remained here as other people's property. But the most numerous way that our people remained here was through intermarriage. Marriage is almost predominantly, almost exclusively between Lenape women and colonial men. Going back, rewinding for a second, long before the Walking Purchase, long before William Penn, excuse me, to some of the very first contacts, the very first folks that came over into this new land to them. There's much to show that many of those early contacts were friendly, and in many cases, often more than friendly. Um, you know, there's a lot of talk about the Thanksgiving legend. And there should be, because typically what most people have been taught about Thanksgiving is a harmful gloss of events. But as with many things, there is a seed of truth in there. And these first colonists that came over, they were largely dependent on our people. They found themselves in a foreign land. They didn't know how to raise crops, what would raise, how the seasons circulated. And they looked to our people and predominantly to our women to help support them and show them how food could be raised here. Our women were, and remain to a large extent, the masters of horticulture of the area. Through tens and tens of thousands of years of working this land, they just had an incredible ability and knowledge, not just how to make the land produce food, but how to make that happen in a way that didn't abuse or caused minimal disruption to the soil, to the animals, to all of our relations, so that we didn't have to use huge tracts of land and destroy it in a season and then move because it wouldn't produce for another 5 years. This was very attractive to the colonists, especially many of those first colonists who came over were farmers, and their charge was to set up food crops to support the next wave of colonists that would come over. We did share our food and our ways with the colonists openly in that way. And that's where there is a kernel of truth to that idea of Thanksgiving being a time where people sat down and ate together. But we did more than eat together. There's a scholar, Robert Grumet, who notes that as early as the 1600s, there are Lenape children being born with curly hair and freckles. And of course, he finds that noteworthy because it's a testament to how early our people were marrying and raising families together. Now, in the early times, in these early unions, uh, children raised in these houses would most often be raised biculturally. They would have Lenape culture and the culture of the patriarch of the family. Um, they would often speak Lenape and Swedish, or Lenape and German. Um, and this continued for some time, but of course, as we get closer to, and definitely as we get to the era of the walking purchase and the forced removals and the bounties, this is no longer the case. At this period in history, Lenape people and Lenape culture are no longer wanted in the colonies. So our people who remain here, uh, if they want to remain here, they have to adopt a double life. And this is what we often refer to as the hiding times. In order to be safe and protect their families and remain in their homeland, they adopt the dominant culture. We cannot speak our language. We can't dress in our traditional dress. We certainly can't hold any religious or spiritual ceremonies. Our ways are labeled heathen. Our language is labeled barbaric. And we dress like colonists. We speak like colonists. We do any rituals or routines that we are expected to do. However, our people refuse to let our culture die. Um, our ancestors of this period continue to pass down our culture, our language, our ceremonies, our ways, as our people had always done through the oral tradition, from grandparents to grandchildren, from parents to children. And this continued, and this is how Lenape people and culture survived in the homelands for centuries. This continued even oh, I'm sorry. This is actually a PowerPoint for uh, an art exam, and we don't need those slides. But this continued even through that most terrible time of the Indian boarding schools, where our children were being taken from our families, often by force or coercion, to have their Lenape culture trained out of them, often under the most brutal circumstances. Um, this is an old picture from Pennsylvania's probably most popular claim to infamy in that regard, the Carlisle School. And I understand you'll be getting more information about that in a future presentation, which is uh, good because I can hardly do this phenomenon justice. So I'm going to move on. But even in this most scary and dangerous time for our people and our children, our ancestors still refused to let our culture die and continued to pass our ways down. But with every teaching that they would give those children, they would attach to it the teaching that you must keep this secret. This is not something we talk about. Um, you keep this to yourself and you don't express your Lenape life in public. But thankfully, those ancestors, those incredibly brave ancestors, did continue to pass our culture down. And as a result, Lenape culture and Lenape communities still thrive in our homeland. And it's been relatively historically recently um, that our people in the homeland have finally felt somewhat safe, sticking their head out and letting the public know, many of us are still here and never left. This is the lineage of my nation. I'm here today representing the Lenape Nation of Pennsylvania, but we are not the only nation that represents the homeland Lenape who remained here in forced assimilation and hiding. Over the river in New Jersey and North Jersey, you have the Ramapo Mountain Lenape. In South Jersey, you have the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape. And in Delaware State, you have the Lenape Indian tribe of Delaware. You also have other communities like the Sandy Hook Lenape, and there's a strong Lenape community still in the Pine Barrens and in other areas. So our people today continue to try to revive our tradition. Now, Pennsylvania, unfortunately, is the only state in our homelands that has never recognized its Native American people. Both of our nations in New Jersey and our nation in Delaware are recognized by their states, not by the federal government, but they have state recognition from their states. Pennsylvania has never recognized either its Lenape people or any other of its indigenous people, which is something that we've been trying to change for a long time, and I'll talk about that very briefly in a second. But one thing we are very focused on today is revitalizing those areas of our culture that were most damaged by the hiding times, by the forced removals, by colonialism. And one of the most wonderful examples of this is our language project. As I mentioned earlier, our language is incredibly endangered. In fact, we have so few speakers of our language that we don't even classify as an endangered language. We are a category below that by linguistic standards called dormant. Back in 2008, the University of Pennsylvania approached us to put on an exhibit, and we did. We put on a wonderful exhibit. It was up at the Penn Museum for 3 years, and then when it finally came down, they shipped it to our cultural center, so you can still come up to Easton and see it there. But in 2008, when Penn was doing the research for that exhibit, they said that there were only a handful of people in the world that could speak the Lenape language competently. Just a handful in the world. That was the state of our language. Now, my nation is incredibly fortunate, and I personally am extra incredibly fortunate that one of those handful of people to whom UPenn was referring is my mother, Shelley DePaul, who is now our clan mother and the keeper of our language. She has dedicated her life to revitalizing our language and bring it back to our people. And I could talk for at least an hour just on her journey with trying to make that happen, from teaching to the community, teaching at Swarthmore College, discovering Zoom when COVID hit and realizing we can try to do this online. But long story very short, today she teaches 6 classes a week online to anyone who wants to come learn the Lenape language. Our classes are always full, and we always have waiting lists for the next one. And just this past year, we finally got to the point where she has been able to train other language teachers to begin taking on other classes. So it has been an incredible, proud journey to see our language beginning to be strongly revitalized. This is an article about her classes in this wonderful book by anthropologist David Harrison about her revival efforts. Oh, and this is a picture of the textbook that we used to teach today. The last thing I want to mention to you before I open it up to question and answer is something else that is entirely central to everything it means to be Lenape, is that we live in harmony with all of our relations. And that doesn't just mean all the two-leggeds of different creeds and backgrounds and races. It absolutely means all of our human, all of our two-legged relations. But it means all of our other relations as well, the four-leggeds, the winged nation, the fish, the standing trees, the grandfather stones. It means what we would say in English as something like being a good steward of the environment. Now, I say it in that weird way because In the Lenape language, we don't have a word that translates clearly into that English word environment. Um, if you think about it, when you say that word, when you say environment, you are inherently drawing a line somewhere. Even if it's the most well-meaning um, sentence ever, you say, you know, I care about the environment. I'm going to go and protest for the environment, or I want to protect the environment. There's a subject and there's a predicate to those sentences. And when you make those utterances, you're putting yourself in one and the environment in the other. We don't have that kind of word that refers to all of nature, all of our relations, except for us, that takes us out of that group. But for lack of a better word in English, it is very important to our people to care for all of our relations in the environment. And we work very diligently to protect the watershed and our sacred Delaware River and our lands and relations here. One of the most wonderful way that we've been able to carry this tradition into contemporary times, when we have all these new threats to worry about. You know, our ancestors, hands down, of course, our ancestors faced trials and turmoils that we will never know today. Um, but there are also things that we face today that our ancestors never could have dreamed of. Our ancestors didn't have to worry about how to get microplastics out of the water or how to deal with poisoning from fracking in our rivers. So one way we've been able to continue our role as environmental stewards in these contemporary times is through the Rising Nation River Journey and the Treaty of Renewed Friendship. Back in, long story very short, oh, and there's much more information about this and other things I'm talking about on our website. I can put that in chat at the end, or maybe you can share it with folks. There's a whole page and extra links dedicated to our river journey. Long story very short, back in 2002, we had been working with a number of wonderful environmental partners, places like the Delaware River Keepers, the Lower Delaware Wild and Scenic, the Friends of the Wissahickon, the Audubon Society, and many others. And we decided to get everyone together to work together on big projects that would protect our homelands. So we drew up the Treaty of Renewed Friendship. You can read the full text of the treaty on our website, but it basically asks people to acknowledge the Lenape people as the indigenous people of this land and to act as good environmental stewards however they can. To celebrate and to spread this treaty, we went out to our sacred Delaware River, all the way at the top around Hancock, New York, actually before the forks come together to make the official Delaware. And we paddled every inch of that river from Hancock, New York, down to Cape May, New Jersey, where it dumps into the ocean. And we stopped all along the way to hold treaty signings to invite the public to come in and commit to these goals. At the end of that first journey in 2002, we had just about 17 organizations come together to agree to that. It was just a wonderful gathering, a wonderful partnership, and we have been doing the river journey and renewing the signing of the treaty every 4 years since 2002. Well, not last summer anymore, but summer of 2022 was our 20-year anniversary. And at the end of that river journey, we had over 130 organizations and over 300 committed individuals come together to sign the treaty. It's been just an incredible journey to see how much support and care people have today in wanting to acknowledge and learn about the true indigenous history of this area and protect these lands that we all share. Um, Oh, this last thing I threw in here, um, many of our partners and our partnerships throughout the years, um, our partners are helping us to fight that battle of finally making Pennsylvania recognize its indigenous people. Like I said, we've been trying for about 30 years. to get the Lenape people recognized by the state of Pennsylvania, like New Jersey and Delaware have done. We've gotten some headway throughout those decades, but never been successful. What we realized recently is that one thing we never did was give our friends and our community partners a voice in this. We always went at it alone. So right now we have a new initiative to try to convince the state to recognize the Lenape people, and we're bringing in the voices of other people, other supporters, non-Lenape people who are interested, to let the officials know that they are interested as well. We have an online petition, we have a letter writing campaign. There's more information about all that on our website. And I just want to mention the last thing, that of those, 130 plus treaty signers that we have today, treaty signing organizations, and many, many other community organizations that are our friends. Like I said, many of them are environmental organizations, but not nearly all of them. Our partners and our friends are incredibly diverse. We have academic institutions, colleges, school districts, K through 12. We have historical societies and museums, um, elder societies. Our culture is one that has a great reverence for our elders, and we always look for opportunities to engage with elder societies. And faith-based organizations, churches of all denominations, and interfaith organizations, and other faith organizations. Um, we have many wonderful spiritually based communities that have partnered with us today in order to help excavate the truth of our history, of our presence here, and help us come together as good neighbors and move forward in a good way, and help combat our erasure and the wrongful stories that have been told about our people. And that is an incredibly important part of revitalizing our culture and allowing us to be present and wholly present and visible in our homelands again. So being invited here to speak is really just so important for our nation, for our people, and I'm very grateful for it, and so is our council. Um, so please, let me know anything you want to hear about, anything I touched on but you'd like to hear more about, things I didn't touch on at all. Let me know what's most valuable for you, and I'll stop sharing my screen so I can see all of you on my big screen.
Okay, one thing toward the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned the trail, I believe it was Wrightstown to Jim Thorpe. And we talked about runners and walking the trail. They have horses that they used back then?
Yes, they would have had horses at that time, but they didn't go to that extreme. They didn't saddle anyone up on horses. They just ran it.
Okay.
Question for you. What does recognition mean? I don't tend to think of us recognizing the Spanish or you name the nation. So I don't understand the recognition and what its impact would have.
Yeah, that's a great question. And the reason why there's no discussion over recognizing the Spanish or the French or the Germans is because they're not, we are here in our colonized lands still. There are actually many conversations in other countries about Spanish people recognizing the indigenous people of Spain, Germans recognizing, the people they displaced. So here in the United States, the question is recognizing the indigenous people on which this country was built. So what recognition actually means, at the federal level, it means very defined things because it's a federal standard. Federal recognition does not give you anything. but it invites you to the table to be in discussions about some possibilities like having some land set aside for you, having a reservation, having funding to help rebuild your communities, being able to have your own schools to educate your people in your culture, having a seat at the table in environmental conversations that would threaten your home, and many other things. You can actually find the federal guideline eligibilities if you look hard enough in the federal documents. Now, our people, we're just, before we even dream, if we ever dream about federal recognition, we're just looking at state recognition. State recognition, by virtue of itself, means absolutely nothing. All it means is that on whatever day this agreement was signed, the state government acknowledged that you are the indigenous people of the area and that you're still here. Now, just that much is incredibly important and so much more than we have. But what it means beyond that is entirely up to the negotiation between the nation and the state. So one nation can have state recognition, and that's all it can mean and nothing more. Another state can recognize a tribe, and that can be a 200-page bill that has things like burial rights and hunting rights and maybe financial support for education and many things besides. Um, One thing I like to point out is that state recognition does not give any right over any kind of casino ownership or reservation. You have to be federally recognized to even think about that. Um, our people, our nation has always been very firm in opposing casinos from being built here in our homelands, not through any ethical choice. We have relations across the country that survive because they have casinos that fund their communities, and that's fine for them. But as the environmental stewards that protect this land, we have always been concerned about the environmental impacts of not just the construction, but the tourism. Um, the things that interest us most about state recognition are the things that affect our identity and the things that uh, help our ability to maintain our traditions. For instance, at our cultural center in Easton, we have many wonderful craftspeople who sell crafts, who actually donate crafts so the nation can sell them to raise money for cultural programs and educational programs. And our cultural center is completely staffed by volunteers because we get no funding from anywhere. We fundraise for all of our funding. Uh, and many of our youths, well, all of our youths and anyone else who comes in to volunteer at the center has to sit next to a sign on the wall that we legally have to have there all day that says, these are not Native American made artifacts. And that is because there is a guideline, a law that you need to be, in order for a nation to sell their items as Native American artifacts, they need to be recognized by the government. That's good. We don't want anyone running into the forest and tying a feather to a stick and saying, look, I make Native American artifacts. So there's some good behind that law, but unfortunately, it is very harmful to people whom the government has ignored. The last thing I'll say, and there are many, many other things I could say, but another thing we're interested in is having a say on threats to our homeland. We have been very active throughout our whole existence in protecting our homeland. We resisted things like the Tox Island Dam, the Penn East Pipeline, rockfall mitigation projects that would have destroyed some of our sacred sites and some very important places in the Poconos and in New Jersey. But we only know about these things because our wonderful partners and treaty signers let us know. They put it on our radar and they bring us to the table so we can help. Nobody has to tell us, nobody has to acknowledge if they want to dam up the Delaware River or if they want to build a huge warehouse and displace families in the Poconos. State recognition could, if the state would agree to it, give us a seat at that table. Not that we could ever point our finger and say, that can go through and that can't, but it would give us a representative to take place in that conversation. So those types of things are the things that we are interested in most. But again, it all comes down to the final agreement with the state.
In consideration of intermarriages and so forth, I think this question is correct. What percentage of blood would you need to be recognized in the Lenape tribe?
To the best of my knowledge, none of our nations today use blood quantum. Every nation, you need to prove your Lenape heritage, that you have Lenape ancestors and that you are Lenape by blood. But, and I don't quote me on this, but I believe none of our 9 nations today have a percentage, as in you need to be 25 or 75% blood. I spend a whole week, actually this is next week, next Wednesday, in my class on Indigenous identity and politics. It's our blood quantum week, and we are solely discussing this for 3 hours. The history of blood quantum is incredibly problematic. It was a device devised by the government for the largely almost exclusive purpose of discriminating against freedmen, Africans who had been here against their will, and also as a political tool to get rid of political opponents by trying to prove that they might have a drop of African blood in them. I won't go further into the details, but I could. Like I said, we talked for hours and hours on this subject. But you can look up things like the one-drop racial rule, the Racial Integrity Act, the Pocahontas exception, and other early laws that introduced this idea of blood quantum and the destruction that it has caused. So again, I'm fairly sure, I can tell you for sure the majority of our nations don't, and I don't believe any of our nations require a percentage, but all of our nations require that you do be Lenape and that you can prove that genealogy.
Very good, thank you.
There's been a long-term debate about the effectiveness of the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs. What's your opinion about its effectiveness?
It needs serious and detailed revision from the ground up. The entire process of federal relationships with Native Americans is not only destructive, it was designed to weed out and to eventually displace and erase the Native American societies that had not been killed through warfare or other means. I'm not saying that that is how people feel today. I'm not attributing these things to anyone who's in the Bureau today. But that is the reason that these federal laws were designed. It's the reason the idea of federal recognition and state recognition were designed. People think, well, that's at least something. It's nice that they offer that. What they don't realize is that the idea of federal recognition was designed to be as exclusive and minimal as possible, to try to exclude as many people from being able to identify as Native American as possible. And many of these things that seem like good-willed or good natures were actually set up to further colonial domination and the subjugation of Native Americans. And the Federal Bureau today has inherited that inherently destructive system. So even if we get the most well-meaning people in the Bureau, they're not going to be any good until it's torn down to its very basic foundations and the most foundational ideas of how we build relationships, how we handle recognition, and all of these other things are considered in a new light with a better consciousness today.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You refer to 9 nations. I don't understand that. I mean, I saw Lenape, I saw Delaware, Lenape. I'm assuming these are subdivisions of the Lenape. But
Great.
Lou was here, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful question. So, two things going on there. First of all, what do you call our people? There's Lenape, there's Lenni Lenape, and there's Delaware. So, with 2 minutes to go, I'll go through this very quickly. Delaware's the easiest one. Delaware is a colonial name. It comes from Lord de la Warre, who came here, discovered our sacred river. They named the Delaware River after him. And then, and as is often the case, the colonists started calling the indigenous people of the area after the name of the river that they lived along. So they started calling our people Delaware, after Delaware River, after Admiral de la Warre. When you hear Delaware, it just means the Lenape. It's just another name for us, but the word Lenape is better. Lenni Lenape actually seems to be a bit of a grammatical misunderstanding. When you translate Lenni Lenape in our language, our people have always been known as the original people or the grandfather tribe by other tribes. But when you translate Lenni Lenape, it translates into something like original people. So that seems to have been a grammatical hiccup. So the best word to use when referring to us is just Lenape. Now, that being said, many of our people grew up their entire lives and for generations being called Delaware, being called Lenni Lenape. And today, as you saw on those slides, we have nations. Our Oklahoma nations are Delaware tribes. That's what they call themselves. Our South Jersey nation is the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape Nation. And as a term of self-identification, that is entirely valid and okay. So please don't go write our nations and say, hey, Chief Adams said you're doing that wrong. You have to call yourselves Lenape. That is their prerogative. But for other people, the word Lenape is best. And then, now that's one issue. We can put a cap on that. Then there's organization. So the 3 words that tend to come up are tribe, nation, and clan. People use them differently, so this isn't always the case, but the most popular use of those 3 words and the way I use them is that a tribe is a genetic group, a cultural group of Native Americans. So the Lenape people are a tribe, no matter where they live. The Sioux are a tribe. The Oneida are a tribe, okay? That's your tribe, no matter where you are. Then within tribes, you have nations. Nations are governing entities. So there are nations of the Lenape tribe that have their own council and self-govern themselves. So we have 4 nations here in our homelands and 5 other nations of our diaspora in the US and Canada. All of us have our own councils. We govern our own communities. We are all of the Lenape tribe, but we are different nations. And then there's clans, which I didn't touch on, but very briefly, there have always been 3 major clans within the Lenape people. Now, these clans don't correspond to nations. There are people of all 3 clans in all of our nations today, but it can be interesting to know. Up north in the mountainous area of the Poconos and New Jersey and New York, you have the Muncie clan. The Muncie clan or the Wolf clan, they're the mountain Lenape. That's my clan. I always have my wolf with me on Muncie Lenape. Down about the Delaware Water Gap, Upper Lehigh Valley area, you got into Unami territory. And the Unami lived all down through Philadelphia and into Delaware. The Unami are the Turtle Clan or the Lowland Lenape. And then the mouthful of our three clans were the Unalaktago. And the Unalaktago live in the Delmarva area and on the shores of New Jersey and Delaware. They were the ocean Lenape. I use the past tense only because since colonialism scattered us, we are no longer concentrated in those areas. Of course, our clans are all over today, but we still keep our clan structure today, and many of our people are very identify very strongly with what clan of Lenape they are.
Chief Adam, thank you so much for spending this time with us. I learned so much, and I think I'm hoping that we as a community of faith can continue to wrestle with how we can be in right relationship with the Lenape Nation of Pennsylvania. And I appreciate the suggestions that you've made and the ways that faith communities and other groups are engaging. So thank you so very much. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. And again, thank you for having this wonderful series. It really shows an important initiative. So thank you.